The gate agent snatched the boarding pass from the elderly man's weathered hands and shook her head with visible disgust. "Sir, there's obviously been some mistake with your ticket," she announced loud enough for the crowded terminal to hear. "You're going to need to move to economy seating." Robert Mitchell stood quietly at gate 47, his pressed khakis and simple polo shirt marking him as just another senior citizen trying to board flight 447 to San Diego. The first-class boarding pass in his hand showed Seat 2A, but the young woman behind the counter was already typing furiously on her computer, her manicured nails clicking against the keys like tiny hammers of judgment. "I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago," Bob said softly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to being heard without raising volume. "The confirmation email shows first-class seating." The agent rolled her eyes and turned to her colleague, a thin man with perfectly styled hair who was processing the business-class passengers. "Mark, can you believe this? Another one trying to scam his way into first class. Probably printed a fake boarding pass at home." Mark glanced over and chuckled, shaking his head as he looked Bob up and down. "They think we're idiots. Sir, you need to step aside and let the real first-class passengers board. We're going to have to reissue you an economy ticket." Behind Bob, a line of impatient travelers began to form, their expensive luggage and designer clothes creating a stark contrast to his simple appearance. Several passengers whispered among themselves, clearly assuming the worst about the situation unfolding before them. Bob accepted the hastily printed economy boarding pass without argument and made his way down the jet bridge, his worn leather carry-on slung over one shoulder. The flight attendants barely glanced up as he passed through first class, their attention focused on greeting the properly dressed passengers settling into the premium seats he had originally purchased. 20 minutes later, as Bob sat quietly in 23C reading a paperback novel, the boarding door opened one final time. A woman in a crisp military dress uniform stepped aboard, her shoulders bearing the 4 silver stars that marked her as one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. General Patricia Wilson paused at the aircraft entrance, scanning the cabin as she always did when traveling on official business. Her eyes moved methodically across the first-class section, then shifted toward economy class. Suddenly, her entire body went rigid. There, wedged into a middle seat between a businessman and a college student, sat a man she recognized instantly. The same steady gray eyes, the same calm bearing, the same quiet dignity that had made him a legend throughout the military aviation community. The general's briefcase slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a loud thud that echoed through the cabin. Every passenger in first class turned to stare as she stood frozen in the aisle, her face showing a mixture of shock and something approaching reverence. Without hesitation, General Wilson walked directly past her assigned seat in first class and proceeded down the narrow aisle toward economy. Passengers craned their necks to watch as the 4-star general stopped beside row 23, came to attention, and delivered a sharp military salute. "General Mitchell," the 4-star general said in a voice that carried unmistakable respect throughout the now silent cabin. "Sir, it is an honor to share this flight with you." Bob looked up from his book and smiled gently, the same humble expression he had worn while being humiliated at the gate. "General Wilson, good to see you again. Please call me Bob." The businessman in the window seat stared openly, his jaw slack as he processed what he was witnessing. The college student beside Bob had stopped scrolling through her phone, her eyes wide with confusion and growing curiosity. From the galley, the head flight attendant rushed forward, her face pale as she realized something extraordinary was happening in her economy section. The same woman who had watched Bob being moved from first class now stood frozen, watching a 4-star general show deference to the man she had allowed to be treated like a fraud. General Wilson leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing every word. "Sir, I had no idea you were traveling today. If I had known, I would have ensured you received proper protocol." The gate agent who had reassigned Bob's seat appeared at the aircraft door, clipboard in hand, but stopped mid-step when she saw the scene unfolding in economy. Her confident smirk from earlier had vanished completely, replaced by a growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Bob waved his hand dismissively. "No need for any fuss, General. I'm perfectly comfortable here. These folks have been very kind." Around them, passengers began whispering urgently to each other, cell phones emerging as people started searching for answers about what they were witnessing. The aircraft had been airborne for 45 minutes when Captain Rodriguez felt the first shudder run through the controls. The Boeing 737 lurched slightly to the left, then corrected itself as the autopilot compensated for whatever had just occurred. In the cockpit, First Officer Sarah Chun frowned at her instrument panel. "Captain, I'm seeing irregularities in the hydraulic pressure readings. System A is showing amber warnings." Rodriguez's hands tightened on the yoke as another tremor vibrated through the aircraft structure. The passengers in the cabin felt it too, several heads turning toward the windows as conversations died down. Flight attendants paused in their service, exchanging worried glances. "Check the backup systems," Rodriguez ordered, his voice steady despite the growing concern in his chest. "Run a full diagnostic on all hydraulic circuits." As Chun worked through the emergency checklist, the hydraulic warnings escalated from amber to red. System A pressure was dropping rapidly, and now System B was beginning to show signs of failure. The aircraft's primary flight controls were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. In the cabin, General Wilson felt the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior that only someone with extensive flight experience would notice. The slight irregularities in the engine sound, the way the plane was handling turbulence differently than it should. Her trained ear recognized the early signs of a serious mechanical problem. She glanced toward Bob, who had also noticed the changes. His calm gray eyes met hers, and she saw the same recognition there. They both knew that what was happening above the clouds was about to become much more serious than anyone else on the aircraft realized. The aircraft shuddered violently as System B hydraulics failed completely, sending a ripple of alarm through the passenger cabin. Overhead bins rattled, and several people gripped their armrests as the plane pitched slightly nose down before the pilots regained control. General Wilson unbuckled her seatbelt and moved quickly down the aisle to Bob's row. "Sir," she said quietly, leaning close enough that only he could hear, "we have a serious problem. This crew is going to need help from someone with your experience." Bob looked up at her with those steady gray eyes that had remained calm through countless emergencies over 4 decades of military aviation. "How serious, General?" "Both primary hydraulic systems are failing. The pilots are good, but they're civilian trained. They've never handled anything like what's coming." The businessman in the window seat tried to eavesdrop, but General Wilson's military bearing and lowered voice kept most of the conversation private. Around them, other passengers were beginning to notice the unusual turbulence and the way the flight attendants had stopped their service completely. Bob closed his paperback novel and placed it carefully in the seat pocket. "General, what exactly are you asking me to do?" Wilson's voice carried the weight of command and the desperation of someone who understood the full scope of the crisis. "Sir, I'm asking you to save everyone on this aircraft. Captain Rodriguez is a competent pilot, but you're Robert Mitchell. You've landed damaged planes that no one else could bring home. These people need the ghost of Edwards Air Force Base." For the first time since boarding, Bob's humble demeanor shifted slightly, revealing just a glimpse of the legendary aviator beneath. Bob stood slowly from his economy seat, his entire bearing transforming as decades of command experience reasserted itself. The humble retiree who had quietly accepted humiliation was gone, replaced by the aviator who had earned a legend's reputation through impossible landings and miraculous saves. General Wilson escorted him toward the cockpit, her 4 stars clearing a path through concerned flight attendants. At the cabin door, the head flight attendant tried to block their approach. "Sir, passengers aren't allowed in the cockpit during flight operations." "Stand aside," General Wilson ordered with crisp military authority. "This man is going to save your aircraft." Inside the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chun were fighting increasingly unresponsive controls. Sweat beaded on Rodriguez's forehead as he struggled to maintain altitude and heading with only manual reversion available. The control surfaces were becoming sluggish and unpredictable. "Captain," General Wilson said as she entered with Bob behind her, "this is General Robert Mitchell. You need to assess your situation immediately." Rodriguez glanced back, irritation flashing across his face. "Ma'am, I appreciate the concern, but we're handling an emergency here. I can't have passengers in my cockpit right now." Bob stepped forward, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded squadrons through combat operations. "Captain Rodriguez, what's your current fuel state? And how long until you reach minimum landing weight for emergency approach?" The question was so precisely technical, delivered with such obvious expertise, that Rodriguez's objection died in his throat. He found himself automatically responding to the command presence that filled the small cockpit space. Bob slipped into the jump seat behind the pilots and immediately began assessing the aircraft's condition with the systematic precision that had made him legendary. "Fuel state is acceptable for extended approach," he said after scanning the instruments. "But with no hydraulic assist, your control inputs are going to require 3 times normal force and twice the lead time." Captain Rodriguez felt his panic beginning to subside as Bob's calm competence filled the cockpit. "Sir, I've never attempted a manual reversion landing in a 737. The simulator training doesn't cover complete hydraulic failure." Bob's hands moved to the backup controls, testing the feel of the manual systems. "Captain, I want you to reduce speed to 160 knots and begin a gradual descent to 8,000 feet. Chun, contact San Diego approach and declare a full emergency. Tell them we need the longest runway available and every piece of emergency equipment they have." As a first officer keyed her radio, Bob continued his rapid assessment. The aircraft was responding, but barely. Every control input required enormous physical effort, and the delays between input and response were growing longer as they lost more hydraulic pressure. In the cabin, passengers sensed the change in the aircraft behavior. The plane was descending more steeply than normal, and there was an unusual quality to the engine's sound. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with forced smiles, but their training couldn't completely hide their concern. General Wilson returned to her seat, but remained unbuckled, ready to assist if needed. She knew Bob's reputation, but she also understood they were facing a situation that would test even his legendary skills. The San Diego skyline appeared through the windscreen as Bob guided the crippled aircraft through its final approach. His hands worked alongside Captain Rodriguez on the controls, both men pulling with everything they had to keep the nose aligned with runway 27. The control yoke felt like it was fighting them every inch of the way. "Airspeed 140 and steady," First Officer Chin called out, her voice tight with concentration. "Localizer and glide slope captured." Bob's decades of experience took over as the runway grew larger in their vision. At 200 feet, he made the critical decision that separated legendary pilots from merely competent ones. "Rodriguez, I need you to pull full back pressure on my mark. We're going to flare harder and earlier than normal because of the control delay." The aircraft was descending faster than ideal, the ground rushing up to meet them. In the cabin, passengers gripped their armrests as they felt the steep approach angle. General Wilson closed her eyes and said a quiet prayer for the man whose skill was their only hope. 100 feet. 50 feet. "Now, Rodriguez," Bob commanded. Both pilots hauled back on the yoke with tremendous effort. The aircraft's nose lifted slowly, fighting against the failed hydraulics. The main landing gear touched down hard but square on the center line, sending a shudder through the entire airframe. Bob immediately took control of the rudder pedals, using differential braking and his knowledge of aerodynamics to keep the aircraft tracking straight as it rolled down the runway. They were down, alive, and safe. As emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and passengers began filing off through the evacuation slides, Captain Rodriguez turned to Bob with visible awe. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but you just saved 147 lives. That landing was impossible. Bob smiled quietly as he gathered his simple carry-on bag. Just glad everyone made it home safe, Captain. But General Wilson wasn't about to let Bob's heroism go unrecognized. She stood at the aircraft door as passengers disembarked, stopping each person to explain what had really happened. The man in economy seat 23C, she told them, is General Robert Mitchell. He's the most decorated pilot in Air Force history and just saved all of our lives. The gate agent who had humiliated Bob hours earlier stood at the bottom of the evacuation slide, her face pale as she listened to passenger after passenger describe the miraculous landing. When Bob finally appeared, she could barely meet his eyes. In the terminal, word spread quickly through the crowd of waiting passengers and airline staff. The elderly man they had watched being dismissed and degraded was actually a living legend who had just performed a miracle landing. Airport security cleared a path as news crews began arriving. The head flight attendant who had allowed Bob to be mistreated approached him with tears in her eyes. "General Mitchell," she said, her voice breaking, "I am so sorry for how we treated you. You saved my life today, and I will never forget what you did for all of us." Bob simply nodded with the same humble grace he had shown all day. Within 2 hours, the airline's senior executives arrived at San Diego International Airport, their faces grim as they approached Bob in the terminal's VIP lounge. The CEO himself, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating policy, stood before the humble veteran with obvious discomfort. "General Mitchell," the CEO began, his voice heavy with genuine remorse, "I cannot adequately express how sorry we are for the treatment you received today. Our staff failed you completely, and there is no excuse for the disrespect you endured." Bob looked up from the cup of coffee he was sipping, still wearing the same simple polo shirt and khakis that had marked him as unremarkable hours earlier. "I appreciate that, but honestly, it's forgotten. Your crew did fine work up there when it mattered." The passengers from Flight 447 had begun approaching Bob throughout the afternoon, each one wanting to thank the man who had saved their lives. The businessman from the window seat shook Bob's hand with tears in his eyes. "My daughter is getting married next month," he said. "Because of you, I'll be there to walk her down the aisle." Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chin arrived together, still in their uniforms, but now treating Bob with the reverence reserved for legends. "Sir," Rodriguez said, "we've both been flying for 20 years, and what you did today was beyond anything we thought possible. You didn't just save our passengers, you saved our careers and our families." General Wilson sat nearby, watching with satisfaction as Bob received the recognition he had always deserved but never sought. By evening, Bob's story had spread far beyond San Diego International Airport. Aviation websites featured headlines about the legendary pilot who emerged from retirement to save a commercial flight. Military forums buzzed with discussions of the ghost of Edwards Air Force Base and his impossible landing. Social media exploded with passenger videos and testimonials about the humble hero in economy class. The airline moved quickly to address the systemic failures that had led to Bob's mistreatment. Within days, new protocols were implemented requiring special verification procedures for military veterans and enhanced training for gate agents on recognizing service members. The gate agent who had humiliated Bob was reassigned to sensitivity training, while the entire crew received education on veteran recognition. Captain Rodriguez called Bob personally 3 days later. "Sir, I wanted you to know that the FAA investigators reviewed our flight data. They said what you accomplished was aerodynamically impossible according to the computer models. You rewrote the book on emergency procedures." General Wilson arranged for Bob to receive a commendation from the Department of Transportation for civilian heroism. She also ensured that his story reached the highest levels of military leadership, where his actions were celebrated as an example of service that extends far beyond retirement. The flight attendants who had witnessed Bob's humiliation became passionate advocates for veteran recognition programs. They volunteered to speak at military appreciation events, always telling the story of the man they had underestimated who later saved their lives. Aviation schools began teaching Bob's emergency landing as a case study in crisis management and pilot decision-making. 6 months later, Bob walked through the same terminal at San Diego International Airport, carrying the same worn leather bag and wearing his familiar khakis and polo shirt. But everything else had changed completely. Gate agents stood straighter when they saw him coming, their faces lighting up with genuine respect and warmth. The head of customer service personally escorted him to the first-class lounge, not because he demanded special treatment, but because the entire airline had learned to recognize true heroism regardless of how it was packaged. Captain Rodriguez happened to be deadheading on the same flight, and he immediately approached Bob with a broad smile. "General Mitchell, it's an honor to fly with you again. I hope you know that every pilot in our company studies your emergency procedures now." Bob settled into his first-class seat, the one he had originally purchased and deserved all along. Around him, passengers who recognized his face from the news coverage nodded respectfully. A young soldier in uniform approached nervously, asking for a photo with a legend he had read about in military magazines. General Wilson, now a close friend, had sent Bob a text before his flight. "Some people spend their whole lives trying to prove their worth. You proved yours in 20 minutes at 30,000 feet. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Bob reflected on how a moment of crisis had revealed not just his own character, but the character of everyone around him. He had always known that respect must be earned through actions, not demanded through titles. Have you ever witnessed someone being completely underestimated, only to watch them prove their incredible worth when it mattered most? Share your story about hidden heroes in the comments below.